I recently got a new GPU, and when I say new, I mean new. This thing just came out. It's also the most expensive GPU I've ever purchased, and damn does it look pretty. But was it a good choice? Was it worth the money? Well, to answer that question, first you must know the backstory as to why I got a new GPU in the first place. And that probably deserves its own video since it's quite a long story and I want to focus more on benchmarks for this video. Long story short, my previous card, the Sapphire 5600 XT, was great! Until it wasn't. It started giving me lots of issues, even in games that previously worked fine. VR games would have this weird, stutter to them when moving around. It's kinda hard to describe. And I was able to fix this for certain games like Half-Life Alyx by setting them to use Vulkan, something I didn't have to do when I first played the game on launch, with the exact same card. Other games would have fine FPS, but would cause full system crashes randomly. Adobe Premiere started doing it too, and the only way to stop it was to underclock my GPU as low as possible. Finally, Counter-Strike 2's level editor came out, and it kinda requires ray tracing support, which I didn't have, so I decided I would buy a new GPU. I knew I wanted an Nvidia card since, sadly, pretty much all the design software I use works better with or only supports Nvidia GPU acceleration. The 4070 Super came out and was getting pretty good reviews, and I just thought, man, I really don't want to have to deal with buying a used card with no warranty, like my then current card, because I dared to replace the thermal paste, thinking maybe it might fix the problems I was having, but that apparently voids Sapphire's warranty. So I get my new 4070 Super direct from Nvidia, install it, and load up one of the only newer games I have, Counter-Strike 2, which just came out with the gun game update, and it ran like absolute shit. At first the game just didn't feel right, like something was off, like my movement was slower or something. And then I noticed, as matches progressed, the FPS got lower and lower. This was most apparent on the map Shoots. The footage you're watching is real gameplay of me getting lows of 29 FPS on a 4070 Super in CS2 with not even max settings. However, at one point I realized something. I still had Vulkan enabled in my launch options from when I had to have it enabled to run CS2 at all on my old GPU. Turning Vulkan off magically made CS2 playable again, but I still feel like the FPS gets slightly worse over time, at least on the gun game maps, just now my FPS is so high it doesn't matter. I'll come back to CS2 later, but this strange FPS problem made me realize I have no way of knowing if this new card is even any better. So I took out my new card and put the old one back in so I could record a bunch of gameplay footage, and then I once again put the new one back in, this time taking my extra Noctua fans out. Go watch the previous video I did that shows me unboxing and installing this new card for more info. I'll be doing all my tests at my native resolution, which is 1920 by 1200, the superior aspect ratio. I don't use any of that goofy DLSS or FrameGen stuff because I didn't fall for the 4K meme. I also don't have any fancy benchmarking software to record frame times or anything like that. And like I said, I don't have that many new games installed, but the games I do have represent a wide selection of games that real gamers might be playing. Most real gamers are not playing the latest Bing Bing Yahoo, they're playing Sauerbraten. Why yes, you can run this game on the integrated graphics of a Core 2 Duo at about the same frame rate. But these results may surprise you. My 5600 XT gets about 160 to 200 FPS flying around in an insta-gib match with max bots on the map Xenon. I recorded this with the CPU graph open so you can see this game is a single-threaded CPU-bound game, which would lead most people to think that a new GPU shouldn't actually get you any better FPS. But actually, the 4070 Super does in fact get better FPS. It rarely would go down to 180, and the majority of the time, the frame rate was between 198 and 200 being the max FPS, which could probably be set higher. But yes, the 4070 Super is actually better in Sauerbraten. Moving on to my all-time favorite video game, the absolute, undisputed masterpiece, work of art, SimCity 4 Deluxe Edition. This is an interesting benchmark because it's less about performance and more about problems. Look at this footage of SimCity 4 running on my 5600 XT. Scrolling around in region mode is perfectly fine, but the moment I load a city and try to scroll around, you'll see it lags like crazy. This is a problem I discovered in early 2023, right before the game's 20th anniversary. I thought, oh, I haven't played some SC4 in a few years, I'll load it up again, only to find my game was lagging with my usual settings. I did fix this problem then by switching to software rendering mode, which means it wasn't using the GPU at all. But here I'm going to be comparing DirectX rendering mode for both, and moving over to the 4070 Super, you will see, in region mode, when I scroll around, it now lags like crazy. What in the world is going on? Luckily, scrolling around in region mode isn't usually that important, and in city mode, scrolling does in fact work as expected. This once again shows my old GPU had some kind of issue. In fact, this is what caused me to suspect I had GPU problems in the first place. If my old GPU wasn't broken, I think the scrolling lag wouldn't happen, and since the game lags in region mode on the 4070, that means I can't give it the win here. A working 5600 would likely be very similar to the 4070 in this game performance-wise. My 5600 is busted, so obviously I'm much happier with the 4070, even if it has that minor region problem. Speaking of similar results and minor problems, let's check out another timeless game, Fallout New Vegas, which on the 5600 XT gets 75 FPS, and on the 4070 Super, it also gets 75 FPS. My screen refresh rate is 75 Hz by the way, and VSync is not turned on. Gamebryo games just work like this. One weird thing though, is that it appears like the 4070 Super has some kind of stutter to it when moving around. So hilariously, I have to give the win to the 5600 on this. I'm sure there's mods and settings I can use to fix this issue, and it would make it so the 4070 does indeed shit on the old card, but vanilla New Vegas is just kinda weird feeling with the 4070 for some reason. And from one apocalypse to another, let's move on to DayZ, a game that is now 10 years old and is probably the biggest comeback story in all of gaming, far outdoing No Man's Sky. Unfortunately, OBS was unable to capture the frame rate counter. Luckily, I made verbal notes of FPS in all of these clips. The 5600 XT got on average about 80 FPS, dipping down to 60 in some instances, and going up higher when looking out into the empty field. The 4070 Super got exactly the same numbers. Well, if you add a 1 in front. DayZ is a very well optimized game and utilizes the GPU fully, so I get a consistent high frame rate of on average 180 FPS. A 100 FPS increase all around, dropping to 160 occasionally and going into the high 200s and even sometimes 300 when looking out into the empty field. Clearly a decisive victory for the 4070 Super. How about DayZ's cousin, ArmA 3? This game was always difficult to run, especially so after they added those Nvidia GameWorks effects that were designed to gimp AMD hardware. I decided to use the high preset, minus the motion blur, and this gave me about 50 to 60 FPS with occasional peaks of 80. Honestly very playable in ArmA 3 terms, since the movement in this game feels like you're playing a 20 FPS game anyway. Interestingly, it's not even using 100% of the GPU. It sure seems like ArmA's decision to use this one random thread is the thing holding the game back. Or is it? Because the 4070 Super came in with over 110 FPS, nearly double what I was getting on the 5600. Of course, I decided to mess with the settings, and this resulted in equally bad frame rates. And once again, ArmA is hardly touching the GPU. My CPU was top of the line for AMD in late 2019, so it should be perfectly adequate for ArmA 3, a game from 2013. Wah, wah, why do you keep only showing old games? Wah. Okay, how about Myst? Not that Myst. No, not that one either. I'm talking about new Myst. This is a remake of Myst that came out in 2021, and not only does it look nice with all the graphic settings on high, it also runs great on the 5600 XT, getting on average 90 FPS, only occasionally dipping into the 70s, and sometimes going as high as 130. In VR though, this game is completely broken on the 5600 XT, and every time you see me take a photo, that's me trying to jump. This game fully utilizes the 5600 XT, unlike the 4070, which only uses about 50% of the GPU, but it gets like 350 FPS, and the mouse is like super sensitive as a result. Enabling ray tracing cuts that FPS in half, bringing it down to like 140 with no immediately noticeable graphical enhancements except the game stutters a bit now and I get screen tearing despite using a G-Sync compatible monitor. So really, the 5600 XT is a better experience in Myst, but I'm sure with a few settings changed, the 4070 Super's problems would hopefully be resolved. Myst is actually an Unreal Engine 4 game and should represent the performance across similar Unreal Engine 4 games. As for Unreal 5, well, I don't think I actually have any Unreal 5 games besides Fortnite, and I'll talk about that later. So I decided to load up the Unreal 5 editor instead. The 5600 XT on this empty open world template map is getting a consistent frame rate over 60 FPS. This is obviously not indicative of a real game's performance, but it is clearly using the GPU quite a lot, as you can see. The 4070 Super gets almost double the performance at slightly under 120 FPS. Moving around in the editor also feels a lot more responsive than it did on the 5600. Speaking of game editors, why not show you the CS2 Hammer level editor, which is one of the reasons I got this GPU in the first place. So Hammer now refuses to launch on the 5600 XT, even though it worked before, not that long ago. How else would I have made these videos? Anyway, the real performance benchmark is the real-time ray tracing, which on this massive map of mine is kinda slow. This is probably not a problem with a map actually made for Counter-Strike, as you can see on this much simpler test map. Also, emissive textures do now in fact work, so that's pretty cool. Does it compile maps any faster? I don't know, probably. It takes forever to build Source 2 levels, but it certainly does utilize my GPU now. Back to games. Since I did an Unreal Engine game, how about a game to represent Unity? And for that, I've chosen one of the few Unity games that is actually good, Onirism, which I call Kato's Cute Game. This is still early access, but it's so unbelievably good. If you like the OG Ratchet and Clank games, you'll like this. But what you won't like are these frame rates on the 5600 XT, averaging in the high 40s and sometimes dropping down to the 30s. This is of course with all the settings maxed out, still kinda playable despite the low frame rate. Obviously you would want to use lower settings to play this. And even on the 4070 too, because it gets only about 65 FPS on average. Now is this a CPU limitation? The game is multi-threaded and only one core is sitting at about 98% utilization. The GPU on the other hand is only using like 48%. But here's something weird. After dying in this wave survival game mode, the next try I'm now getting more GPU utilization and significantly higher FPS, like over 110 on average now. Also notice less CPU usage on that same core. Magically. I guess this just goes to show, even in such a well-made game like Onirism, the Unity game engine is still kind of a mess. But you know what game engine isn't a mess? The Blam engine, or more specifically the Halo 3 engine. In this case, eldewrito. This one is less of an FPS test, as this game can run on pretty low-end systems, and I don't have an FPS counter. This is more of a compatibility test for the 4070. eldewrito is known to have some issues with newer graphics cards. Luckily, I launched the game and it ran fine. The performance feels about equivalent between the two cards, and it should, since this game isn't the hardest to run. I'm calling this one a tie, even though the 4070 did crash on me when I blew up all these fusion coils. Moving on, I obviously had to test Garry's mod, not just for performance, but also compatibility. If you're new to this channel, I'm a professional environment artist, and the last big job I did was recreating Hogsmeade from Harry Potter in Garry's mod. During the life of this map, I got lots of FPS reports in, and one common trend I found was people with 30 series Nvidia cards were always having problems. This is apparently a known issue with older versions of the Source engine, and may or may not be fixed now, but I had to make sure that Gmod didn't run like absolute ass. The map I'm using to test is called GM Neonopolis, a really cool map I want to do a review of, and it actually uses a lot of textures that I made. I used two locations, both close to each other for benchmarking. One sitting in the corner of the map here, which puts the entire level into view. The 5600 XT is getting 113 FPS, and the 4070 Super is getting, drumroll please, 144 FPS. It is actually faster even in a heavily CPU-bound game like Gmod. Check out the second location with wireframe enabled. Wireframe is the FPS killing device. You can actually see the GPU usage go down, and I'm only getting like 15 FPS on the 5600 XT with wireframe enabled. But the 4070 Super, 55 FPS with wireframe. Holy shit, that's actually amazing. I've never seen Gmod with wireframe enabled run so good. So, confirmed, the RTX 4070 Super is the card to get for Garry's Mod gaming. Now to represent more advanced Source Engine games, I have Black Mesa. All settings are maxed out, and an empty match on DM Undertow, sitting in this corner, I'm getting about 70-ish FPS on the 5600 XT. The 4070 Super, big surprise, 116 FPS, but it also gets better FPS overall in this level, especially in this area where I get about 90 FPS compared to the old GPU, where this room would get like 50. So, major improvement, but still kind of lacking considering the 4070 is 4 years newer and costs twice as much. I think tuning the settings would give an even better uplift in this game. Black Mesa is a game I've been meaning to sit down and play since it fully came out in 2020, but how about a game that I haven't launched since 2020? Stalker Call of Pripyat, and with Misery Mod 2.1, which I've modified to fix some game-breaking annoyances. On max settings, both GPUs experience quite erratic FPS and random lockups. I feel like the game wasn't like this the last time I played, but maybe it was and I just didn't care because I was embracing the misery. The 4070 is again getting better FPS, usually in the 160s and sometimes going up to the 200s. The 5600 XT gets about 120 on average, but with dips to as low as 70, which you can see isn't really that pleasant to play. It really is, not feeling very good, actually. It's kind of bad feeling. Could some of that be from, the whole not having a fan attached to my graphics card situation? Yes, it's very possible that is the situation. Fuck! Why is this here? Oh, there was another one! There was another one! Why was there another one? Why were there two fucking chimeras there? What the fuck? You may be wondering, what did I mean in that clip by not having a fan attached to my graphics card? Well, you may have noticed throughout all these clips, the 5600 XT is running kind of hot at like 70 Celsius. Well, as it turns out, while I was testing these games, I realized that even though I made sure to reconnect my Noctua fans to my GPU, they, for some strange reason, were not spinning at all. Which means every single clip of the 5600 XT you're seeing in this video is the GPU running entirely passively. Does that invalidate this whole test? Maybe, but it's winter and it was really cold in my room that day, and due to my small case, these CPU fans push around quite a lot of air. Also, I'm pretty sure that when I run Furmark with the fans working, the temps will stabilize at like 75C anyway, so I don't think it invalidates anything. In fact, it sure makes the 5600 XT look pretty good considering it was able to play all of these games passively cooled. And there's one last game I want to show you a comparison of. Counter-Strike 2. Like I said before, CS2 refuses to run on my 5600 XT unless I force Vulkan via the launch options. And on the flip side, the 4070 Super runs like absolute shit with Vulkan, so this will not be a fair comparison. Plus the whole no fan thing. I'd assume if you have a working 5600 XT, then you can run the game fine without Vulkan. The crazy thing is, and maybe this is placebo, but the game just feels right on the 5600 XT. It feels responsive, even though the card is only getting about 110 FPS on average, depending on the map, of course. Though that could just be that I'm so used to the feeling of playing on the 5600 XT. I can own people on the card. And switching to the 4070, even though I'm getting way better FPS, like 130 to 260, it just feels different. Is this the Nvidia Reflex low latency thing? Maybe. Does using an Nvidia card make you worse at gaming? Probably not. One big advantage the 4070 Super has over the 5600 XT is that it doesn't have random lockups when you first start the game. The 5600 XT and apparently other AMD cards have this like shader cache problem, and so this causes the game to freeze for a second occasionally, but after the game's been running for a bit, the problem just goes away. The 4070 Super does not have this problem at all. CPU utilization between the two cards is about the same, with no individual cores being maxed out at all. GPU utilization is quite different, the 4070 only using about 50% of the GPU and the 5600 using at least 90%. This means I'm using significantly less power on the 4070 while getting far better performance than the 5600. So yeah, obviously the better graphics card is better. Big surprise! And to wrap up the video, I'll go over a few games I don't have comparisons for, starting with Fortnite! I'm running this with everything on high, ray tracing and all that stuff enabled. The game gets on average 90 FPS with rare dips into the 70s. The game seemingly runs flawlessly and looks great. No stutter, no lockups, it's great. Though maybe I should turn the settings down a bit, because if you compare these pics of my game versus my buddy Gunther's game, you can see he kind of has a major advantage when it comes to overall visibility, but my game's way prettier though. Another pretty game that is widely used for benchmarks is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a game from late 2018. I have every setting maxed out, and using the benchmark, I got an average of 139 FPS. I ran it again with SMAA instead of TAA, and it was surprisingly lower at 136. Comparing this to the Gamers Nexus chart, they're getting significantly better FPS than me at a higher resolution, 190 FPS at 1440. Now, is this because they're using a much faster CPU than mine? Maybe. Or maybe it's because they're using the high preset and I have everything cranked and ray tracing enabled. I actually plan on playing this game at some point, but first I'm playing through Rise of the Tomb Raider, which came out in 2015. This game is great so far. I really enjoyed the first of the Tomb Raider reboots, which I played a long time ago on my RX 480, and I'm just now getting around to playing the follow-ups. I'm running this with everything maxed out. I actually had to enable triple buffering because it was running too good and was causing my UPS to constantly beep at me while playing. I've disabled that for the benchmark, which gives me an overall score of 204 FPS. Really, I better be able to play this game at max settings flawlessly, considering my GPU is 9 years newer. One annoying thing is the DRM on this game. My internet is ass, so sometimes it will just go out, and when that happens, the game just closes. Even if I'm in the middle of doing something in the game, no warnings, it just closes as if it's crashing. And speaking of horrible DRM, I was gonna have a GTA 5 segment here, but after waiting 5 days for the over 100 gigabyte download to finish, when I went to launch it, it would just get stuck in an infinite loop of trying to open the stupid Rockstar game launcher. So maybe one day I'll play GTA 5, but it's gonna be a repacked version because my Epic Games copy might as well not even be playable. And that's it for the benchmarks. Time for my conclusion. Obviously, the 4070 Super is a way better card, especially compared to my broken old one. But this thing cost over $600 after tax. Sure, it's well built, but the performance uplift on this card compared to my broken 2020 mid-range GPU is, in my opinion, not exactly what I'd expect for $600 and 4 years newer. I figured it would be like significantly more, though it is usually 2 times better FPS in most games, 2 times the FPS for 2 times the price, but also 4 whole years newer. Is some of that lack of uplift due to other factors in my system? Maybe, but it just seems like for such a high-end card it would be significantly more. And this card really should have had 16 gigabytes of video memory. It was rumored to have had 16, but it came out with a measly 12, which is a spit in the face if you do anything that heavily relies on VRAM like I do. Nvidia's own chatbot they just released requires 16 gigabytes of VRAM. What a joke. I'd be a lot less pleased about the price if there were 16 gigabytes of VRAM. Sure, I could have bought the RTX 4070 Ti Super, and that has the extra 4 gigabytes of RAM, which probably only cost them like 16 bucks, but it's $200 more than the 4070 Super. Also, I don't think there's a Founders Edition of the 4070 Ti Super, and I really don't like buying partner cards. I much prefer the Nvidia OEM ones. Also, the Ti Super probably wouldn't even fit in my case. Anyway, as you've seen in this video, I struggled to find modern games to test. Most games I play don't need this kind of hardware, so really the true test as to if this card was worth the money comes down to a longevity test. How many years will this $600 GPU serve me before I consider getting something else? I would hope that I'm not going to be in the GPU market for at least another 8 years, preferably 10, but who knows what will happen in that time frame. Maybe 10 years from now there'll just be some kind of generic computing system that can run any software without the need for specialized hardware like a GPU. If you made it this far into the video and are not yet subscribed, go click that button down there and then go and watch all of my other videos since you obviously like them. But that's it for now. I'll be back next week with another video that this time will hopefully not be about graphics cards.